Why would you write something critical of the Arab world and of Muslim societies at a time when Muslim societies are so under fire, so criticized, so bigoted against, et cetera, by the West? Take it away.
First of all, Robin, I'm incredibly moved by your very generous introduction. Robin is a dear friend of mine, and when I was in jail overnight, after I spray painted that racist shit Pamela Geller's ad in the subway, Robin kindly tweeted for me all night and even went to offer to pay my bail, which I didn't need, but she went at 3 a.m. to the tombs to get me out. So Robin truly is a dear friend and a mentor, and yeah. All right, I'll stop. We'll do this later. No, why now? For many reasons now. I think the primary reason is because obviously Egypt, my country of birth, and many other parts of the Arabic-speaking Middle East and North Africa are going through incredible times, revolutionary times, and if not now, when? Another why, because when 17 female revolutionaries were sexually assaulted in the guise of so-called virginity tests in March of 2011, there was more anger directed towards the women who exposed this horrendous crime than towards the military that assaulted them in that way. Because all the outrage that should have been directed at the men who were breaking us or trying to break us and sexually assaulting us and dragging us through the streets, and you saw the pictures, all that outrage and all that rage was again being directed towards women and not the men, and not the trifecta of patriarchy, as I call it, the state, the street, and the home, that was complicit in maintaining that misogyny. And also, and I think this is really important, I honestly feel that we're going through a global feminist moment. Whatever region of the world you're looking at, whether it's China, where I had no idea, much to my own ignorance, it speaks of my own ignorance, that they have their own homegrown feminist movement. And soon after International Women's Day this year, we discovered that at least 10 feminists were arrested after they protested against misogyny and patriarchy, and 5 of them are still in jail in China. We saw the women in India rise up after the Delhi gang rape. Or they've been speaking out against sexual violence for a very long time, but we finally got to hear their voices. We saw women in Afghanistan who insisted on burying the woman called Farhunda, who was lynched a few weeks ago, and they broke with Muslim tradition to do that. And we saw women in Turkey who did the same after a woman was raped, and they actually told the local imam, no, we will not abide by your tradition because no other man will touch her, and we will bury her. And here in this country, we saw the 3 queer black women who launched Black Lives Matter after Trayvon Martin was murdered. And the common thread between all of these places, alongside feminism, is we are all women of color. And you often hear of feminism, and in my part of the world, we're often told feminism is a Western import, it's not part of our culture, it's not part of our religion, blah, blah, all that stuff. But all of these women speaking out are saying, we're sick and tired of having to choose between racism and sexism, and in my instance, having to fight Islamophobia and xenophobia in many parts of the world where Muslims live as minorities, having to fight against that and having to fight against the misogyny. So basically, my long-winded answer to you, Robin, is that this book, we need this book now, despite all of the shit that Muslims have to put up with, because I'm an Egyptian Muslim woman, and I'm the way that I am because of the way that Egypt and Islam shaped me. And you're hearing more and more women like me who have been shaped by these things saying, it is our right and it is our role to criticize the misogyny from within and without, and also fight those who are trying to silence us because Islam is under attack, and fight those who are attacking Islam. So we're fighting many, many things. But just because those racists and those xenophobes are there does not mean that we don't need a book like this, because these are revolutionary times, and without the social sexual revolution, our political revolution will fail.
There you go. We're done for the night. Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, which is the subtitle of Headscarves and Hymens, which is my favorite title possibly of all time. Headscarves and Hymens. She got away with it. But I think Mona's point in the book, or one of her points, is that there can be no real revolution without a sexual revolution. And I think it's important for Western feminists to understand that this is not now nor ever has been a white Western global North fill in the blanks movement. It's a global movement. In the 12th century, there were harem revolts in Turkey. In fact, Turkey had a woman on the Supreme Court in the 1940s, way before we did. So there are indigenous feminist movements in every society around the world, and there always have been. People have never been happy on the plantation. I think what is required of Western feminists is to earn the trust of feminists from the global South. Not preach to them, learn from them, look for the similarities. Patriarchy is always so good at emphasizing the differences that we can afford to emphasize the similarities and the overlap. For example, and I'll say this one example and then I want to lead into something from it. Female genital mutilation, which you deal with in the book, was thought to be, for a long time, something that only happened in and around the Middle East. In actuality, when feminist historians and feminist social scientists began examining the phenomenon, discovered a very interesting thing, which changes the way that feminists in the global north can relate to it, because if you're only pointing at something that happens over there, then you have a sort of Lady Bountiful tone to it, and your critique of the practice is not welcome because it makes it harder for women in the region to fight it because they're accused of being your pawns. However, if you come at it with new knowledge that clitoridectomy was practiced in the United States as late as the 1940s and 1950s as a cure for masturbation and for lesbianism, that it was also practiced by the Christians and still is in parts of Latin America, that in no way, shape, or form is it specifically an Islamic practice. You go at the issue then with a very different take. You go at it in that we're all in the same boat. The degree may change. We're all in the same play, although the sets and the costumes and the dialogue may seem different. That said, I couldn't agree more that no revolution is capable of happening without more than half the people of any given country on board, and we are, as women, more than half the human population. This particular segment of that half had a very interesting trajectory, so I would love, the book is not only a first-rate reporter's eye on these issues and on that region, and in fact on other regions as well, but it's a subjective and vulnerable and courageous story of an individual woman, this woman. And so I would love you to talk about that trajectory a little, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, thank you. I think it's really important to make those connections that you make, Robin, and as a way into my own personal story. I think one of the things that were most important for me to point out in the book, and it's something that I got a grasp on more and more during the 13 years that I spent in the US, so I'll back into my story and kind of go chronologically backwards, is that during my 13 years in the US, and especially when I would go to the South, and especially when I taught quite briefly at the University of Oklahoma, where I often describe Oklahoma as the Middle East, because there are so many similarities between life there and life in the Middle East, the conservatism, the religion, the patriarchy. I learned that whereas in the Middle East I fight the Muslim Brotherhood, the political Islamists, here in the US I fight what I call the Christian Brotherhood. And I think the thing that connects them and the thing that connects all men of the extreme right of any religion is something that I say everywhere I go. And I keep threatening to put on t-shirts, and that is they're obsessed with our vaginas, and my message to them is stay out of my vagina unless I want you in there. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, because the religious right has basically just kind of whittled us away to just sexuality and the control of our bodies. And the connections that has enabled me to make between where I come from and the places where I've traveled is that the connection between modesty culture, where you wear hijab or you wear niqab and you cover your face, and purity culture that I touch on in my book and talk about those connections in my book, where you sign a virginity pledge to your father until you get married, where your community is obsessed with your purity and your body. And my own trajectory through that modesty and purity culture was very important for me to share in the book, because when it comes to the political revolution, when it comes to protests, when it comes to going on the street, I often say that I've never been able to urge anyone to go on the street because I cannot accept the responsibility for what would happen to them, because I know the price that you can pay for going on the street, having had my arms broken, having been sexually assaulted, but also because I know that because people know who I am, I have a great deal of privilege that protects me, And despite that physical and sexual assault and the detention that I faced, I'm here with you today and I didn't face an even worse fate. Because that privilege that I have, my name and my fame, etc., is a great privilege that did shield me and got me out quick. But so it obliges me basically to fight, I believe, harder than those who don't have that privilege. But I would never tell someone, go out on the street and protest. I would say, I'm going to protest, I'm going to this protest, and if someone is so inspired to go to join a protest, you know, that is great. But having said that, to take that into the personal realm, and to make those connections between the modesty and purity culture that I personally spent many years of my life struggling with, I try to share many of my own personal stories in this book, and including very difficult things to talk about, like why I waited so long to have sex, why it took me so long to take my headscarf off. And for me, one of the things that I learned the most about myself, if I can say that, writing this book, which was very difficult, was why my feminism was able to wrestle with my hijab, which I wore for 9 years, and I say it took me 8 years to take it off, and taught me this lesson about how easy it is to choose, this word choice, you know, choose to wear a headscarf, and why it was so difficult to choose to take it off. So one question I keep asking myself in the book, and that I still wrestle with, is why was it easier for my feminism to deal and wrestle with my headscarf, my modesty culture, than it was to deal with sex, and why it took me so long to unpack my own personal guilt and to basically kind of brush aside what I'd been taught about sex and sexuality. So I mentioned those things, and I know that they're going to be very difficult for my family to read, and from where I come from, it's not common for women to talk about sex, and that's exactly why I did it, because these are revolutionary times. And we share a common friend, although she's a much dearer friend to you than she is to me, but she's one of the feminist mentors I mentioned in the book. That is the Egyptian feminist Mona Eltahawy, who I saw in conversation with Robin and Gloria Steinem during those heady revolutionary days in 2011 when they spoke together here in New York, and I felt like I'd died and gone to feminist heaven. I'm like, oh my God, Robin Morgan, Gloria Steinem, and Mona Eltahawy in one room. Mona Eltahawy was one of the first and very few women where I come from who spoke so openly about her cutting and what it meant for her at the age of 5 when she saw her mother there during her cutting, and what it taught her as a girl in our culture, coming from our faith backgrounds, to see your mother at such a painful juncture in your life. And so I try to deal as honestly and as openly with these personal things, because what Noelle did, and what all these other feminists who I mentioned in my book, who are of my heritage, what they did by being so open and so honest and so courageous is what we often say, you know, that our veteran feminists do, is that they offer shoulders for us to stand on when we feel the least powerful. And I remember becoming a feminist at the age of 19 and feeling fucking terrified that I knew that I was basically opening a door and walking down a corridor I could never turn back on. Because you understand it is going to destroy the patriarchy, of course, but by destroying everything that you've been taught, everything your family has taught you, everything your religion has taught you, but there is no turning back. So I try to imagine 19-year-old me and how scared I was. And I'm writing that book for her, essentially, because there are so many things when I look back on my life, especially, and this is why I talk about sex so openly. Why did I wait so long to have sex? And when people say to me, you know, I get so many tweets, and I live on Twitter, for those of you who know me, I live on Twitter, and I get all these people who write to me the most banal and ridiculous things like, the Middle East is falling apart, why are you talking about sex? As if sex is not an important thing. And my answer to them is because sex is about consent and agency. And what is a revolution without consent and agency? And, you know, and then I get asked, well, you know, women in the Middle East are struggling with literacy and employment and what? Because you're a poor woman, you shouldn't have consent and agency and the right to enjoy your body and the right to enjoy sex with whoever you want to, because you can't read or write. Your body is not yours and doesn't belong to you. So sex is central to this. Sex is something that I spent so many years of my life struggling around and against, and that guilt. Why? And every time I hold readings like this, the number of young Muslim women, and just a couple of days ago, I met with a Muslim woman. I hear from Muslim women who share these stories because they need someone to speak this true. It took me the longest time to be able to share with fellow Muslim and Arab women sex and guilt. Why can we not even speak to each other about this? Consent and agency and sex are integral to our liberation. And that's why I insist on speaking about these things.
Well, we're done. Every time she finishes, I feel, there's nothing more to add. But I do want to add some global context to this and the role of women and sexuality in a general way. There is a book, we've talked about this, she and I. Actually, it's very rare you'll hear authors plug a book that neither of them have written. But it's by Valerie Hudson and a whole group of scholars. It's called Sex and World Peace. And they did a 20-year study and found, finally, what feminists all over the world had been saying. Now they've made honest women of us in academia and with research. They found that the arbiters of whether a state is aggressive or peaceful are none of the arbiters that we've been taught. Not civil society, not high GDP, not natural resources, not level of democracy and democratic participation. None of the things that we've been given to think. The arbiter of whether a state's an aggressive state or a pacifistic state is how it treats its women. So the centrality of more than half the human species to not only our individual security, which if it was nothing more than that we have a right to, but to a state's security, and in fact to global security, is now absolutely unarguable. Not to speak of the fact that if we want to have a planet at all, we need all brains on deck at this point, and silencing more than half of them ain't going to get us anywhere. In the South, in the civil rights struggle in this country, Mona, there used to be a saying which Nina Simone took and made into a brilliant song called Mississippi Goddamn. And it was about Alabama's full of shit, and Louisiana's a real problem, and Georgia, oh my God, but Mississippi, goddamn. And to me, that's the place that I reserve for Saudi Arabia. There's problems in Jordan, there's problems in all across the Middle East, certainly in Syria, definitely in Egypt, but Saudi Arabia, goddamn. You first really came a cropper of what it was like to be a female human being, even a small one, in Saudi Arabia. Tell us that story, which is riveting in the book.
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
I often say about Saudi Arabia, as a woman there, as a girl there, you have two options. You either lose your mind or you become a feminist. And so at first I lost my mind and then I became a feminist. But Saudi Arabia truly is, and we have so many Saudi friends in common. Saudi Arabia honestly made me the woman that I am. I was born in Egypt. I was born to Egyptian parents from Cairo. I grew up in a home where, I come from a very middle-class family in Egypt. My parents met in medical school, and university education in Egypt is free. So don't get any idea that my parents were spending lots of money on their education. Gamal Abdel Nasser made university education free for everybody, and my parents grew up at a time where universities in Egypt were actually good and they weren't overpopulated. So my parents met at medical school, they did their master's degree together, and then they got a government grant to study for a PhD in the UK, in London. So I grew up in essentially a very feminist home. I grew up with parents who valued knowledge and who brought up my brother and I, and then much later my sister when she joined us, with the value of knowledge and education. And they told us, we expect the same from you all, that you will all go to university and that this will be an important thing in your life. And the last year that we spent in the UK, my mother was the breadwinner. My father wasn't able to find a job, so he was a house husband. This is 1981 in the UK. And he'd come and pick us up from school and cook dinner, have dinner ready for my mum when she came back from the hospital. And then we moved to Saudi Arabia, and my world has turned upside down. My mother can no longer drive. I can't go anywhere unaccompanied. I've got grown men asking my father if they can marry me, and grown men in supermarkets asking if I'm alone, and I get groped during pilgrimage, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And this is the first time in my life that I'm wearing hijab, and I look like a nun. I'd gone to Catholic school in Glasgow in Scotland, doing that last year in the UK. So Saudi Arabia was like someone turned the lights off in my mind. And I could not understand how this could be a Muslim country, because I was brought up as a Muslim, as I said, in his very feminist home, yet he was another very, very different example of Islam, and a different example of an Islam I did not like, and an Islam that was suffocating me, and an Islam that made it clear that women were the walking embodiment of sin. And I knew that at the age of 15, when we moved to Saudi Arabia, that there was something very wrong, but I didn't have the words for it, and this is where I fell into a very deep depression. And I began to wear my hijab in Saudi Arabia as a way of fighting that depression and of hiding my body from the eyes and hands of men. And teenage girls will often go through this globally, where you go through this stage where your body begins to develop, and you just don't know what to do with your breasts and your hips, and the way men begin to look at you. So I thought, I'm just going to hide from these men because I could not handle it, and at the same time feeling suffocated by religion. And then at the age of 19, I discovered the antidote to all of this shit, and it was feminism. And ironically enough, it was feminism on the bookshelves of my university in Saudi Arabia. So to this day, I don't know who this renegade professor was at my university who put all of these journals and books of feminism in Saudi Arabia. So a real kindred spirit there. And there I discovered Mona Eltahawy, Fatima Mernissi, a whole bunch of women who put, now I didn't have, like I said, I didn't have the words to that frustration. You know, you often hear of Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique and giving word to something that didn't exist, and women not being able to a certain sector of women in the US. Obviously this didn't apply to women of color in the US who had a completely different experience at the time. But this idea of finding something that put into words what you were struggling with, that was my feminist awakening in Saudi Arabia. But you know, interestingly enough, I also came across in Saudi Arabia on those bookshelves, the perfume garden. And those of you who know Arabic erotica will know what the perfume garden is. The perfume garden is this tome, it's like our Arabic language Kama Sutra. It is written by a sheikh, a cleric, and he begins, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most beneficent, something like, praise be to God for the cock and the cunt, literally, translated from the Arabic. So here I have an example of the erotica of my own heritage in a country that is constantly and consistently fighting women and women's sexuality and just the mere existence of women. So I'm like, huh, whose Islam is out there on the streets? I do not understand this. And I find all of these feminist books written by Muslim women of various Arabic-speaking countries in the region. And then I understood, you know, that there are all these different varieties that you're often, especially outside of the region, unaware of. But that the Saudis worshipped a misogynist God that was not my God. And this is a God with a small g.
I wonder if it's possible to even estimate the crushing blow to the spirit of a young woman who is on her Hajj and is circling the Kaaba, is circling the stone and is groped. And is groped. And it was a policeman, wasn't it?
It was a regular man behind me doing what we call, in Arabic it's called the tawaf, when you circle the Kaaba, the cubical structure towards which we pray. And then it was a policeman. So it's like just a regular man and a policeman. Who do you go to if the police? Well, see, this is it. The police rope you during Hajj. The police break your arms, sexually assault you. The police, all cops are bastards. There is a reason for the saying.
Yeah. And the police today in Egypt, if you want to bring us up to date, and there's this tremendous choice that you have now in Egypt between the religious fanatics and the secular fascists.
Exactly.
Basically.
Both of them are fascists.
Yeah.
And it's a false choice.
Patriarchy and patriarchy.
Yeah, it's two sides of the same coin, the patriarchal coin, the authoritarian coin. And many of us in Egypt who are of the revolution and continue to support the revolution refuse to make this false choice between military rule and political Islam, because they're two sides of one coin. There's something about Saudi that I wanted to add, because we both know about this very well. There is a feminist movement in Saudi Arabia that people outside of Saudi Arabia know nothing about. And that feminist movement, as well as the professor or the librarian who put these feminist gems on the bookshelves, in 1990, when I had moved back to Egypt in 1988, but I would visit Saudi Arabia several times a year to renew my residency papers. But 1990, many of you will remember, was the year that Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded Kuwait. One of the best things about the invasion, if I can say that an invasion brought about anything good, was that a lot of Kuwaitis fled into Saudi Arabia by driving their cars. And a lot of Kuwaiti women drove across the border into Saudi Arabia in their cars. And a group of amazing Saudi professors, academics and professionals, around 42 of them, in 1990, I doubt many of you heard of this, got into their cars as an act of civil disobedience to break the ban on women's driving. They said, well, our Kuwaiti sisters coming across the border, who are also Muslim, therefore this driving ban has nothing to do with Islam. Our Kuwaiti sisters are driving cars, and we deserve the right to drive cars. Now, back in 1990, these women were fired from their jobs. They had their passports confiscated. They were called whores in mosques and in the media. And even their husbands were also faced retribution. Fast forward to the year 2007, 2008, a Saudi feminist called Wajiha Al-Huwaidar gets into her car, makes a video of herself and uploads it on YouTube. Her friend was filming her in the passenger seat. And she's basically reviving this act of civil disobedience. So you have feminists engaged in non-violent civil disobedience in Saudi Arabia. And every year, Saudi women, beginning with Mona Eltahawy, who was a protege of Wajiha Al-Huwaidar, in 2011, as an act of inspiration after the revolutions began, Mona Eltahawy got into a car, filmed herself, spent 9 days in jail, and every year on October the 26th, Saudi women have a campaign to get into their cars and break this ban. Now the Saudi royal family, and I mentioned this in my book, make this song and dance about how Saudi society is not ready and you have to leave us alone. And in my book, I bash not just the West, deservedly so, for the billions of dollars that they spend on Saudi oil and the billions of dollars of weapons that they sell to the Saudis, but the rest of the various Muslim countries as well, for giving the Saudis a free pass, because the Saudis act like they own Mecca and Medina, our holy sites. Despite all of this, and the Saudis saying, our society is not ready. It's not Saudi society that's not ready for women's liberation. It's the Saudi regime and the zealots among the clerics who keep them in power that are not ready. The women and their fathers and their brothers who go and bail them out whenever they're arrested, they're ready. And they will be the ones who will start a feminist revolution in Saudi Arabia. And when Saudi Arabia has that feminist revolution, everything will be solved. And you know that, Robin.
I do. No, it is the cutting edge, the front line. I want to read a couple of passages. I'll juggle this somehow. The Arabic-speaking countries of the Middle East and North Africa stand apart in their terrible record on women's rights. Not a single Arab country ranks in the top 100 positions on the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report, putting the region as a whole solidly at the planet's rock bottom. The annual report looks at 4 key areas: health, that's life expectancy and so forth, access to education, economic participation, salaries, job types, seniority, and political engagement. Neighbors Saudi Arabia and Yemen, for instance, are eons apart when it comes to gross domestic product. This is an important point she makes. But only 8 places separate them on the Global Gender Gap Report, with the Kingdom at 127 and Yemen coming in at 136, the very bottom. Morocco, often touted for its so-called progressive family law, a 2005 report by Western so-called experts called it an example for Muslim countries aiming to integrate into modern society. Morocco ranks 129th. So that's a very interesting point that you make, because some people will argue, well, the sexism is so toxic because of poverty. But here you have one place with a huge GDP and another place that's at the bottom of the poverty index, and the sexism is identical.
Well, you know, you often, I've heard all kinds of things. I've heard people will say it's because of colonization, and I will say, yes, we had a colonial history, and it was awful, but we got rid of the Brits in Egypt in 1952. What have we done to reverse the misogyny? And the Brits were complicit in it. What have all the countries done since they got rid of occupation and colonial powers, the countries that liberated themselves from occupation and colonial powers? And then other people will say it's the poverty. Obviously, it's a combination of many things, but Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, when you look at where they stand on the various indices, when you look at a country like the United Arab Emirates, where a man has the right to beat his wife and children as long as he doesn't leave a mark. Wealth does not buy you feminism. political engagement does not make you a feminist. I once got into an argument with an academic during a program I recorded for Al Jazeera called Head to Head, where she seemed to imply that our revolutionary men, of course, they believe in women's rights, but the two do not go together. And this has historically been shown, and I quote, "La mujeres libres," the anarchist women of Spain's civil war. And I'm particularly obsessed with this particular time in Spanish history, because the anarchists had kind of the nearest to a utopia that we could get to during the 2 or 3 years that they ran Catalonia, until the communists basically got rid of most of them. But even they, the women of anarchist Catalonia, would say the compañeros outside of the home, during union meetings and during marches, would treat women like comrades and like equals. But once they got home, they would remove the revolution as if they were removing a costume. In my part of the world, we often take our shoes off when we go home, and I say that my revolutionary comrades from the men often remove the revolution as if they're taking their shoes off. So it's not about political engagement, it's not about poverty, it's not about wealth, it's not about how long ago did we got rid of colonization, it's about misogyny and patriarchy. And that's why I bring in this spectrum of misogyny along which every single country stands. There is no country that has gotten rid of misogyny. And those of you who follow global politics will remember when the Swedish foreign minister tried to take a stand on feminist principles against Saudi Arabia, and the Arab League prevented her from speaking because the Saudis were able to dominate the Arab League in that instance. And she tried to make a point about a blogger called Raif Badawi, who was supposed to receive 1,000 lashes. He was supposed to be flogged. He's only been flogged once because of international outcry. But she was also going to make a point about Saudi Arabia's horrendous women's rights record. She was attacked in Sweden by the business community. This is Sweden, a paragon of feminism. And yet this woman was called emotional and not, she was also told that she didn't have a grasp of international diplomacy. This is the Swedish foreign minister in a country that is in a region that consistently ranks on the top of these indices. So clearly misogyny is global and is independent of those various things that we mentioned, poverty and education levels. But the point that I make about the parts of the world where I come from is that even in those countries that have made progress in things like education, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries have more women on campuses than men. These sexist laws that we have, that trifecta that I often talk about, the state, the street, and the home, mitigates against all of those advances that some of those countries have made, and that is where the revolution lies. That's where the social and the sexual revolution has to step in and take apart and ask why.
Also, since we're on the subject of external criticism or people being afraid to make external criticism on human rights issues, we're at a PEN event. This is fortunately PEN International, not PEN United States. PEN United States, as you may know, I'm sure the audience knows, recently got its knickers in a twist, because it wanted to give, and it in fact did give, an award, a free expression award to Charlie Hebdo. Quite a few, I'm not a member of PEN, but quite a few members of PEN, over 200 in fact, disagreed because the racism, the sexism, which didn't get mentioned, the profound sexism and homophobia of Charlie Hebdo was an issue. And it's not that they don't have a right to be racist and sexist. God knows nobody's stopping them from being racist and sexist. But to award that seemed a bit problematical. And PEN America went ahead and did it anyway. My point in various commentaries that I wrote, and I'd love to hear you let loose on the subject, was that Charlie Hebdo's excuse for being profoundly anti-Muslim was that they're anti-everybody. You know, they've been anti-Christian, they've been anti-Jewish, they've been, you know, mutually offensive to everybody. They're an equal opportunity offender. Except, you know, they lost sight of the fact that they were all a group of pale males. And they didn't offend pale males. Somehow that group was free of being skewered by them, and they didn't notice that. So it seems to me that the responsibility of those who are in a privileged position, and everybody is in a privileged position vis-a-vis something else, there's always somebody worse off. It's incumbent upon those who are to in doing real satire, to be careful about satirizing the powerless, because it's such a damn fucking cheap shot. And maybe spend satire the way that, oh, I don't know, Pope did and Swift did, and to this day Key and Peele do, and Jane Wagner did, that real great satire, Whoopi Goldberg does. That is directed at the top. That is what political satire really is, and that is not what Charlie Hebdo engaged in. So, given that as a backdrop, because it then gets very confused in some people's minds with, well, does that mean that then you can't criticize at all, or you shouldn't criticize? And given the position that you and I share, that human rights are human rights, and you should speak up for it wherever it is, and people should not fall into a cultural relativist position that, well, it's okay. Well, I don't think that's good, but it's okay for them to do what they want with their women. Hold forth.
Well, you know, we're essentially talking about the left and the political correctness of the left.
Are indeed. We already know we hate the right.
That's a given. As if that even needed to be said. But no, I do make the point, though, to make clear that the right has no role, as far as I'm concerned, with this and in this. But I know that what the right will end up doing, the right ends up using my words and trying to demonize my men using my words, because this is what they do. They will say, well, Mona says this and she's a Muslim and therefore it must be true. And I'm like, fuck the right. I want nothing to do with them. And your first question about why now when Islam is coming under so much attack, I'm a Muslim, I'm an Egyptian, it is my right to internally critique my culture and faith. And that's where I tell the right, the same thing, to basically stay out of this. And I take that position on racism, as I mentioned, you know, with the ad and all these other things, the Pamela Geller ad and this new campaign coming up and all this awful stuff that's been happening in Texas. My position on offense has been and always will be, I believe in the right to offend and I believe in the right to protest that offense. And I received my first death threat after I actually defended the right of the Danish newspaper to publish the cartoons of the Prophet. And I make a distinction between cartoons in a newspaper and an ad in a subway. Because cartoons in a newspaper, you will go buy that newspaper, you will open the newspaper. It is very different than an ad in a subway station where if I'm taking my kids to school or if I'm walking, I have no control, no filter between me and the ad. And worse, that ad is basically $6,000 worth of basically the marketplace giving you freedom of expression. So it's a different kind, this is a different realm of freedom of expression now. And I personally do not have $6,000. What I have is the ability to go and buy a $4 can of pink spray paint and spray over it. But not cover it, because I did not want to cover it. So I believe in the right to offend, but in the right to protest that offense. And that's what I tell the right wing. And when the right wing talk about, you know, well, Muslim men are this, Muslim men are that, that's where I bring in the Christian Brotherhood and say, well, you know, what the right wing in this country has done to women's reproductive rights, the abortion clinics that have had to close in the South, the case of Purvi Patel in Indiana, who has gone to jail on charges of feticide, and you've hardly heard a thing because she is a disempowered brown Hindu woman. When that starts to happen to Christian white women, then maybe we will hear a big fuss. But that is this country's struggle. And that is what the religious right wing is doing to this country. And believe me, the religious right wing in this country has much more power than the Muslim Brotherhood ever dreamt of having politically in my country. So this is our fight here. And I say our in this instance, because now I speak as an American. But also, as that Egyptian American, when I address the left sometimes act as if they need to protect my culture and my faith from me, a woman who was made by that culture and that faith. Being Egyptian and being Muslim and growing up in Saudi Arabia as a teenager made me the woman I am. But they'll often want to stand between me and that culture and religion as if they're trying to protect it and also saying, but you know, you're just giving ammunition to the right wing. But also, there is a form of implicit racism in that because it's that soft racism of lower expectations. But that's their culture, that's their religion. What kind of culture is it that would allow beating of a woman and a girl as long as you don't leave a bruise on her? What kind of culture in which girls and women had no say in making allows the control of female sexuality through the cutting of perfectly healthy genitals, knowing the clitoris is the only part of the body that is solely for pleasure. That is not a culture I had any role in creating. That is not a culture that deserves respect. And that is what I say to the left wing, because they are not affected by this. They have the privilege of speaking about something that has nothing to do with their personal life or their lived reality. So I place myself in the middle between the right and the left, and I also say, get out of my way when I'm fighting the misogynists of my own culture. Because the misogynists of my own culture are sitting there also trying to shut me up, like Tariq Ramadan, a favorite of the Western media, because he speaks with a French accent, and he sounds like he's going to save European Islam, because he's talking about moderation and tolerance, but he is a misogynist, the misogynist of the school that goes, shut up woman, and let me fight for your rights. The perfect mansplainer. So you have to put yourself in the middle of all of these fights, and basically just get out of my way. So I don't ally myself with the misogynists of my culture, certainly not with the right wing, and I tell the left wing, your cultural relativism harms me more than it helps me.
Well, you're trying simply, I wouldn't even say you're in the middle, I'd say you're trying to be visible. Because if the left and the right are defined by men, usually, certainly in this country, pale males, and they see only each other, then they can only see any statement made by anything from independent as serving one or the other. You will serve the right by this, you will serve the left by this, because that's what Imanova was about. They only can perceive each other, and anything other than that is non-human, is invisible. So if the definition of human is to be male, in this country to be pale male in the global north, but to be male in any country, then you see the problem. You know. Let's talk a little bit about solutions so that everybody doesn't leave here psychotically depressed. And then we're going to, in a little bit, go to questions and answers. We get to ask the questions and you have to give the answers. Solutions. Sex education, all of the ones that you, because she goes into this in the book, and it's a very important segment.
A quick answer to the solutions is destroy the patriarchy, clearly, because that is the common enemy. And there are many ways and levels of doing that. I think individually, whenever I'm in groups like this, and in case anybody asks me what can I do to help you, my quick answer is do nothing. Do nothing. Because we're rescuing ourselves, we're saving ourselves, we're fighting this fight, no one can fight it for us. What you can do to help me and the women in the region from where I come and about which I write, is to fight your fight here. At least 25% of women on college campuses in this country experience a form of sexual assault. Fight that. Fight against what the religious right wing is doing to women's reproductive rights in this country. Fight against the kind of shit that women get when they try to run for politics in this country. Because believe me, when the men that I'm fighting and the misogyny I'm fighting where I come from read about these statistics, they say, well, do you know how many women are raped every 5 minutes in America? As if that makes anything better. But they just shrug and they say, you see, even in America, that country that you keep talking about where you lived, they still treat women badly. So fight your fight here, and fight most importantly complacency. I think complacency is so dangerous. So many young women will just shrug and say, until they're hit with this awful reminder that misogyny is very much alive and kicking, I don't need to be a feminist, everything's been solved. No, we are post nothing. If anything, the past 2 or 3 years in this country have taught us we're not post-racism, we're not post-sexism, we are post-nothing. It is an illusion to think that we are post-anything. And the number of protests that have taken place, I've joined in this country, where I see people who were activists in the 60s and 70s come out on the street and just, with a sigh, say, I thought we had sorted this out. Why are we still protesting the same things? So fight complacency. On a political level, hold your political representatives to account for the hypocrisy that allows them to throw women like cheap bargaining chips across the table when they are meeting with our regimes. And if they dare, if they dare, like the Swedish foreign minister did, bring up the issue of women and misogyny, and then our regimes say, it's none of your business, it's our culture and religion, say, no, you know what? Women's rights are human rights, and we are human, and it is our business. The State Department produces a human rights report every year. And in that human Human Rights Report, because we used to get copies of it when I was a journalist at Reuters, and you can look it up online. There was a section in every report every year on women's rights, and they know what it's like. They know that in the year 2002, 15 schoolgirls were burnt to death in Saudi Arabia because the morality police wouldn't let them out because they weren't veiled. What kind of culture allows a morality police, basically a militia, that is allowed to operate by the Interior Ministry, made up of zealots, to go out there and choose a veil over a girl's life? There should have been a revolution in Saudi Arabia when those girls died, and absolutely nothing happened. When the Secretary of State goes to a country like that and says nothing, it is a crime. When John Kerry goes to Saudi Arabia after women have engaged in acts of non-violent civil disobedience against that ban on driving, and he's asked, what do you think of what the women did? And he shrugs and he says, the social environment in Saudi Arabia is none of our business. That is the equivalent of someone going to South Africa during apartheid and shrugging at racial apartheid, because what's happening in Saudi Arabia is gender apartheid, and we have to name it as such. So hold mine, because I vote in this country, political representatives to account and tell them stop this hypocrisy when it comes to women's rights. And they have voices in those countries to amplify. So I'm not saying send our political representatives to rescue us. Tell them to listen to the women on the ground, those feminists I mentioned in my book, and those feminists in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the region. When it comes to, and I'm asked sometimes about the UN and international organizations, the UN is a fucking joke most of the time when it comes to women's rights, because you have conventions like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women that allows the countries in the book that I've written and other countries to hold reservations against the very things that are supposed to protect them against all forms of discrimination. So what's the point? What is the point of a body like UN Women, which a huge amount of fanfare was made for? And I'm glad UN Women exists, but the US administration, along with its other Western allies, fought tooth and nail to keep Iran off UN Women, saying the Iranians are misogynist, and yes, in many instances they are misogynist, but believe me, women in Iran have more rights than women in Saudi Arabia. And yet, Saudi Arabia was able to buy its way into a seat on UN Women. What is this hypocrisy? So those are the things you can do. Locally, kill the complacency and fight. Continue, because we're not post-feminist. Politically, hold your political representatives, the hypocrites that they are, and tell the UN to stop being such a bunch of, what is it now that Salman Rushdie called those writers? Pussies? Why do we keep saying pussies when we're trying to say that people are weak? I don't even know the origins, because some people argue about the origin of pussy and whether it actually means a vagina or not. But I think that we are in agreement that a pussy is a very, very powerful thing. So tell the United Nations to stop being a bunch of what? Wusses? Cowards. Cowards.
Dicks.
Ovaries of steel. We need ovaries of steel. That's what we need.
There's a wonderful word, concupiscent. Do you know this word? Concupiscent. It comes from cunt, which is one of the oldest words in the English language. You can always tell the four-letter words that have remained intact because they're used so sparely and nobody says them out loud, so they stay intact way back from Middle English. And it comes from cunt, which is okunis, which meant knowledge. To ken something to this day, you can. So concipitance is female power.
Can we revive cunt?
Well, I think we're doing our best. we're really need that. But I'm working on concipitance. CUNCIPO, and then the rest is potent. So you are one hell of a concupitant person.
I take that as a great deal of praise. Thank you.
Well, it is. It's meant that way. In our last about 10 minutes, I'm going to diverge from what we've been talking about and talk about you as a writer. Because you're a wonderful writer, and you're a wonderful journalist. But journalism is its own form of writing, and you're also a writer. What's next? Have you thought?
I thought actually of doing a book of essays that touch on all of those points that I've made that try to place feminism and misogyny on that global spectrum. Because I've moved between many different places. I don't know if most people in this room know my own background, but I was born in Egypt, lived in the UK, lived in Saudi Arabia, spent some time in Jerusalem, and I lived in this country for 13 years. And there are definitely things from each of those countries that have gone into making me the woman that I am, not just Saudi Arabia and my rage against the misogyny. But things like being in Jerusalem and seeing my ultra-Orthodox Jewish neighbors and seeing the similarities between them and the Saudis, and seeing that line that connects all the religions, most of them, and I keep saying, whenever I say that all religions are misogynist, essentially, and try to control female sexuality, the Wiccans will say, not the Wiccans. But, so, which Wiccans? Right? So, exactly, right? It's always not all men, not all Wiccans. So I would like to do a book of essays that basically trace those lines through the various countries that I've lived in, but also that tell the stories of things that, I mentioned in this book, Khadija. And I make the Khadija and Aisha, and for those of you who are not Muslim, I'll give you a very brief history. Khadija is the first person who became a Muslim and who accepted Muhammad's message. And she, for me, is an eternally fascinating person. She was Muhammad's employer. She was 15 years older than him. She was twice divorced and possibly once widowed. And she proposed to him. She was 14, he was 25 when he accepted her proposal. And she was his only wife until she died. And I wonder, first of all, about the culture that produced this woman, Khadija, this amazing woman, and about this woman who was able to nurture this young man. And then when he got the message, and we're taught, in Islamic education, that he thought he was losing his mind, and she told him, no, I believe in you, and helped him with his message and with his campaign. But the fact that he didn't marry anyone else but her says a lot. Our clerics rarely ever talk about Khadija. She is known, all the Prophet's wives are called the mothers of the believers. But they hardly ever talk about her, and there's a reason. Because Khadija is their worst nightmare. She is the worst nightmare of those murderous shits, otherwise known as ISIS or Daesh, as we call them in Arabic. Because she is a woman that represents consent and agency with a big C and a big A. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she got it. And she got the Prophet of Islam. Nobody talks about this. That this 40-year-old woman proposed to a 25-year-old man who became the man who was the Prophet of Islam. What our clerics do obsess about is Aisha, who was one of the wives that he married after Khadija passed away. She was the daughter of his best friend, Abu Bakr. And we are told variously that she was maybe 6, maybe 9, maybe 19. And I say in the year 2015, it's not important how old she was in the 7th century, because in the year 2015, it is a crime to have sex with a child. It is not a crime to marry an older woman. And I have a thing for younger men, as I often say. That is not a crime. So why are our clerics silencing the activists who very bravely, in various countries like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Sudan, try to fight for a minimum age of marriage and try to keep that minimum age of marriage? And those clerics will say, you are breaking the tradition, the sunnah of the Prophet. But they never make it seem like it's a sunnah to marry an older woman. And one of the things that I want to write something about, an essay, is we have a huge problem with male youth unemployment. Why aren't our esteemed clerics telling our young unemployed men, marry an older woman? She has money. She can take care of you. Why is this not a solution in our part of the world? Instead, they are shamefully silent when 8-year-old girls are raped on their so-called wedding night by men 5 years older than them. So those are the kind of things that I want to get into more. Because, outside of the region, you never hear of someone like Khadija. And the question that I ask in the book that I want to explore more is, when I look across the various Muslim majority countries today, and I ask, where is Khadija? She is nowhere to be found. What have we done to Khadija? And my dream, my feminist dream, is to create Khadija's Daughters Brigades. And those of you who attended the pen opening, for the pen opening night, we were given this homework for a vision of 2050. And my vision of 2050 was, I have to send you the script for this, I haven't shown you this. It was May 4th, 2050, and 3 women were going to be inaugurated. One was the first Egyptian woman president, who was a bisexual poet. One is a Saudi woman who is an atheist, who's about to become the first female mufti. And one of the first things that she does is she gives women the right to have multiple spouses. And the other one is an American woman who is going to be, she's going to be inaugurated to become the 3rd consecutive woman president in the US. And she's called Octavia Hernandez because her parents named her after Octavia Butler, the science fiction fantasy writer. And one quote by Octavia Butler that I will mention now by way of ending, by way of reintroducing feminism and women, when in my scenario for 2050, these three women met on Twitter in 2015 when a feminist, and it's actually me, I don't say that. Maybe all these three women are like, you know, me, split up in three. But anyway, so a feminist in 2015 posted a link to that film, Born in Flames, which some of you might remember, was the queer anarchist film that Lizzie Borden made in the 80s. And these women saw this film and they became friends, and they stayed friends until they were about to be inaugurated. And when Donia the Egyptian and Arij the Saudi become frustrated with the difficulty of being feminist and women fighting feminism, Octavia, named after Octavia Butler, would quote Octavia Butler and tell them, sometimes drowning people die fighting their rescuers.
Wonderful. You didn't send it to me. You better send it to me. Yes, and I think there's a knuckle in that. I don't know if that should be way. Yeah, I don't think it should be put in the book of essays. I think it's down the line. I think it's a whole knuckle. Last question, and then we'll throw it over to the audience. You ready for this? I'm going to throw you a curveball. What would you say, looking back at your still very young life, is your greatest regret or sadness? And what would you say is your greatest joy or pride?
Okay, I wasn't expecting those two.
Yes, okay.
That's what we're going to talk about, the revolution.
The revolution.
I was just going to say that is the revolution. That is because the revolution really is personal. I think that one of the things that I try to say as often as I can is the most subversive thing a woman can do is talk about her own life as if it mattered, because it does. And I quote Muriel Rukeyser, one of my favorite poets, in her poem Katja Kollowitz, where she says, what would happen if a woman spoke about,
if one woman told the truth about her life,
exactly,
the
the
world
world would split open. So yeah, our joys and sadnesses are important, because I think that our personal narratives are often very dangerously sidelined by this idea that we all have to be very rational and very logical and very academic in our approach to life. And I think we can be both. We can be emotional, we can be personal, and we can be academic, and that is what we are. We should not have to split ourselves into all of these things. My greatest sadness and regret would have regret. Well, it would go back to this, my so-called obsession with sex. Why I waited, and this is an honest truth, why I waited so long to explore my sexuality, which I think it makes me very sad when I think of my younger self, and why I denied her something so pleasurable and so beautiful. It really does make me very sad. And it makes me very sad that I couldn't discuss this with fellow Muslim women. It took me a really long time to pluck up the courage to talk to other Muslim women about this because of the guilt. And so I'm so open about it in my book because I hope younger Muslim women reading this book either share with me or with their friends their own journey to their own sexuality in whichever direction and form it takes.
And the greatest pride or joy?
Yes, my greatest pride of God. Wait, that's a tough one, you know.
More to come, let's hope.
Well, you know, I think surviving, honestly, surviving various things. But when they broke my arms and sexually assaulted me, I felt I not only was robbed of the ability to write for 3 months because my arms were in casts for 3 months, but I felt that a great sense of beauty. I lost a great sense of beauty. You know, our mutual friend Gloria Steinem, very soon after I was attacked, she sent me a very kind email and suggested that I read a wonderful book called Trauma and Recovery by the feminist psychiatrist Judith Thurman. And I highly recommend this book to everyone. And in this book, Judith Thurman talks about, she makes connections between sexual violence and the ensuing trauma, especially PTSD, and the PTSD that war veterans experience. And she makes this wonderful point about how war veterans have things like the unknown soldier and a recognition from their society that they performed this wonderful, honorable role. Whereas those of us who survived sexual violence often feel that we've lost something, and I feel that I lost a great sense of beauty. But there is no way that we can go to honor that. There is no monument to the unknown sister. And one of my dreams, and I often discuss this on Twitter, especially around the anniversary of my assault, because it's a very difficult time for me, is in every city to find allies in the artist community who would be willing to donate, volunteer their time and their art to building a monument to the unknown sister, as a place for those of us who've survived sexual violence to go and find that beauty, that whatever sense of loss that we've experienced. Because until that place is built and made, I basically did it on my own body, because one of the ways that I promised myself that I would celebrate survival was to dye my hair red and get tattoos on both of my arms, as a way of saying I survived and I'm still here, but creating beauty on my own body, and making markings of my own body, on my body of my own choosing. And I will end by quickly describing, because these tattoos make me very happy. I never wanted to get ink before I was assaulted. And on my right arm, I have the ancient Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. She's the goddess of retribution and sex. And the way I often describe her is, first, she'll kick your head in, then she'll fuck your brains out. And then on my left arm is Arabic calligraphy, and it's the name of the street where many of us were assaulted, not just me. At least 12 other women were also sexually assaulted. It's called Mohammed Mahmoud. And that's also the street where my university used to be. So it's a street on which I have a long history. And then under it is the Arabic word for freedom, Hurriya. Because those of us who fought against the security forces or protested against the security forces on that street, we're liberated on that street, and we feel like we're a family. Any Egyptian who took part in the 5 days of protest on Mohammed Mahmoud will tell you that we feel we're a family. And it was a turning point in the revolution, because those protests, those 5 days of protest, were instrumental in making the military junta, the 19 Mubaraks who took over after Mubarak stepped down, it made them give us a date for our presidential elections. So this is the political and the personal. This is the social and the sexual revolution. And until that monument to the unknown sister is built, we have to create our own kind of mobile forms of beauty and joy. So I hope there are many more to come, Robin.
We'll go to questions in a moment,
I've shared this story with other readings and events. I was invited to speak in a town called Zagazig, which is a very conservative town northeast of Egypt. It's where Mohammed Morsi, our Muslim Brotherhood president, was from, and it's a stronghold of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's by no means, the privileged elite, Cairo, and all the focus usually is on Cairo. And I was invited to speak at this TEDx event at the university there in Arabic by a 19, 20-year-old pharmacy student who wrote to me and said, please come and speak at our TEDx event because we need a feminist like you to come and shake our community. So there, this is a young man, so there is clearly a hunger for feminism there, and a feminism that they've already been working on in their own community. I always say, would not have known about me. And when I went there and spoke in Arabic about the need to start calling various forms of violence against women forms of terrorism. And they were very receptive to this. And the amount of young women and young men who came up to me. I had one young woman there in this very conservative town. She was probably in her late 20s, and she said, I've been following your work for years. I'm a feminist. I recently separated from my husband because he said I'm too ambitious for him. I'm too ambitious. She said this. She said he just wanted me to be focused on the home, but I have much more in mind. I never met this woman before, and here she is, in this conservative town, telling me that her husband says you're too ambitious. And I had young men coming up and sharing various stories of frustration about how they're trying to stop their male friends from harassing girls and women on the street, and how that's just destroying what young boys and men think of as manhood. So this is my way of explaining to you that this idea that feminism and women's liberation and that it's good for men and women already exists in many of those parts that we think we haven't reached. So I think my answer is twofold. One, those of us who are privileged, I believe, must fight 10 times stronger than those who don't have privilege and who don't have perhaps the time that we have and the tools at our disposal. But it's also really important to recognize that they're already fighting on the ground in various forms that we don't see. I mentioned in my book the short story writer, the Egyptian short story writer Alifa Refat, who traveled across Egypt with her husband. She's long since passed, and I believe she's deeply unappreciated. I hope we get to revive her writing. But she traveled across Egypt and met women of all different backgrounds, and many of her stories revolve around women in the rural areas. And there's wonderful stories about women who either fight back or who recognize the misogyny that they're fighting against and find ways to protect each other, protect their daughters. Excuse me, I'm fighting. themselves and to protect their daughters. So I think it's a recognition that we need to work across all of those lines that often men have created for us as a way to separate us. This idea that you were talking about earlier, Robin, that we think all these things, the differences between us. When it comes to Yemen, I haven't been to Yemen, but I've met many Yemeni activists who have shared with me their stories of what happened during their days of revolution, and how the women there who did feel they had privilege would go to Change Square and the various squares that they had there, and they would set up these tents, and in these tents they would talk to people about the importance of things like freedom and democracy and standing up to the regime, to people who had received very little education, to people who were out there perhaps protesting for the first time in their life. So I think there's a need to recognize that some of us must fight harder than others, but that we have resources that we can share, and that we can learn from each other best practices of what works in a conservative town. Because at the end of the day, before I left and I had one of those young women, she came up to me and she was furious, and she said, what are we going to do to help the young women I know here in Zagazig, whose families are trying to break them whenever they try to do something independent? And I said to her, I would love to help you in any way I can, but I can't come from Cairo. Because you're just going to say, who is this Cairo woman who thinks she's going to come and rescue us? So she knows what she needs to do there. She just needs to get together with her friends and do their own kind of grassroots activism on the ground. And then we need to start working across those city lines. So I think the flame is there, the ferocity is there. It's just a recognition that we need to find each other. And that's how they found me. I would not have been able to find them. Thank God they reached out to me from this very conservative town. And I'm a tenacious optimist, so I think we can overcome all of this.